Thank you, Barry. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to be here. It's my first time in Ann Arbor. Really enjoyed meeting people in the community and seeing some of the campus, and really kind of inspired and impressed by the thinking that's going on here at this particular moment when it comes to academic innovation, new forms of degrees, new ways to have impact in the community and focus on the employability of graduates, graduate education. So these are all themes that we'll be talking about today, and I hope you'll find it very relevant. Should be about 40 or 45 minutes of presentation, and then we want to make it interactive and really have a discussion, which this is a good sized room for. And we will also make the slides available afterward, so you don't have to scribble down all the data points if you find anything particularly interesting. We're also recording it for the future if you want to come back to it later. Yes, so I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy. It is a long center name. Hopefully someday we'll get a donor that will name it for us and help us build out our space, but it's purposefully both sides of the equation. It's higher education and the talent strategy piece, so corporate learning and development, employers' hiring practices. So we not only look at how higher ed is changing and evolving and what's happening in terms of new program models and what it means for policy and questions like that, but also bringing the voice of the employer into the education space and studying and reporting on how hiring practices are shifting, what credentials are in demand, those sorts of dynamics, which you'll see here on the slides today. I think, as we're probably all well aware, it's an interesting moment for higher education where we have major questions about the sustainability of the business model for most colleges and universities, not all, but for many. There's more college closures, there's declines in funding based on certain institution types, and just a much more competitive market. Overall enrollment in higher education in the United States has flattened out and declined somewhat. That varies by institution type and sector. But again, we're probably all well aware of some of the headlines and the pressures and the dynamics in this sort of storm that is assailing the foundations of the ivory tower, if you will. What's also happening, though, is in fact a changing pace in the world of work. And I'm increasingly intrigued by ways that we can measure that. In terms of economists, for example, are doing studies on skills longevity. And we've seen this first in information technology and in marketing and in some other areas. But when people say the half-life of skills is shorter today, there are many ways that you can actually go out and measure that and see that the pace of business and of the need for upskilling and lifelong learning, as we'll talk to here in a moment, is just increasing. And I think that's a giant kind of key contextual pressure on higher ed institutions, which are designed around a business model that's sort of purposefully deliberative and slow-moving many times, governance processes. So even when colleges and universities are at their most innovative, it typically takes a year or two, certainly many months, to design, develop, approve a program. But the pace of the job market in certain areas is moving much more quickly, and I think that's where you've seen some success with MOOCs and new short-form program offerings that can be stood up very quickly. But I think that's an important piece of context, is to recognize that indeed the pace of hiring and skill development and so on has evolved and is moving very quickly. Now, when we look at educational credentials, this is certainly inclusive of degrees as well as certificates and other forms of credentials that we'll dig into. Perhaps surprisingly, but maybe not surprisingly, hopefully encouragingly, what you find, and this data comes out of a recent survey we did at the end of last year, December 2018, one of the only surveys of its kind recently. We surveyed 750 hiring leaders at a representative sample of employers across the US, all company sizes, all industries. And we asked them, over the last 5 years, has the value of educational credentials in your hiring process, for example, relative to experience, has it increased, stayed the same, has it declined? And on balance, for the majority of employers, it increased or it stayed the same. And yet, the headlines and the narrative that's out there often is very much around, well, the degree is less valuable today. And we will begin to unpack what levels of degree and credential does this apply at. But I think foundationally, that's a fairly interesting finding. And it actually lines up as well with what you see when you look longitudinally at burning glass data, if you're familiar with that, or other surveys. At its worst, in certain sectors and industries, the value of a degree is sort of flat, or the emphasis on it might be declining a little bit. But educational credentials very much matter in employers' hiring process today. And partly, yes, there is a little bit of credential inflation, and we could have debates and important discussions about that. But I believe, and I think it's confirmed in the data, it's very much driven by the changing nature of work that I just alluded to at the outset. When we asked employers who had increased their educational requirements, why was that happening? 63%, a majority, said it's because the skills needed for these jobs have evolved. So in certain cases, the demands in the labor market are evolving upward, and correspondingly, employers might be seeking a bachelor's where previously it was an associate degree, or a master's where previously it was a bachelor's. And certainly there are cases as well, like we see in the media and on the conference circuit, et cetera, of employers like Google and like IBM for certain roles not requiring a college degree, let's say, and beginning to create some alternative pathways. That does not mean necessarily or at all that they're devaluing the college degree or they wouldn't necessarily prefer the college degree. And I think that comes up on our next slide, which is another kind of key foundational look at some important data. This is out of Burning Glass Technologies, which is a Boston-based labor market analytics firm. In essence, they can reliably track most job postings across the entire US economy or in a region or for a certain time frame. And as you look across the full calendar year in 2018, this is a sample size of 25 million job postings. You see some interesting patterns in terms of the educational preferences that employers are seeking. Not necessarily requiring, but preferring or seeking. Because you might have a job opening that is a bachelor's required, but a master's preferred. And employers often hire for promotability. In other cases, maybe they'd like a bachelor's degree, but it's not at all needed. But this is one way that they express their preferences. And the key takeaway when you look at this, and I'd note that the totals add up to a little bit over 100% because there can be a bit of overlap, is that the majority of the job postings out there are seeking at least a bachelor's degree. So 54% of all the job openings in 2018 that Burning Glass tracked were at the bachelor's level, and then about 1 in 5 at the graduate degree level. That's mostly master's, but that would be master's and PhD. And among the economists that track job market growth and the official forecasts that are done and that sort of thing, you see higher growth rates at the master's and the graduate level and certainly at the bachelor's level than you do for lower levels of education in the US workforce, and it also applies globally to some extent as well. I think it's about 12% of the US adult population has a graduate degree, so that's an example of that gap there, and certainly less than half have a bachelor's degree. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone needs a bachelor's or a master's. There's a lot of very important work being done and problems to solve in terms of sort of more baseline levels of education, a lot of energy around alternatives to college, apprenticeships, certificate programs, sub-baccalaureate diplomas. But you can very much see that in the job market, if employers could have their pick of candidates, it's often at the bachelor's level and above. And because of that, but also in a way that we're moving beyond just the bachelor's degree as the key credential, I like to think about this as a post-baccalaureate world of sorts. Also on our employer survey, 64% agreed with the statement, the need for continuous lifelong learning will demand higher levels of education and more credentials. Again, that doesn't mean everyone needs a bachelor's or a master's, but that we're entering this environment in the second machine age or third machine age, or however you frame it, where there's a need for that continuous upskilling. And it might be short modules and bites of education or new credentials and experiences on top of and augmenting whatever your prior level of education and training is. And at this point, I'd also note education and experience are very much intertwined. And generally, and especially the further you get out from school, whether that was a graduate program, a bachelor's program, or something else, the more your work experience and your portfolio is what the employer will prioritize. Of course, you also have highly regulated industries that you need a degree and you need a license, and that will come up in just a moment here. But beyond traditional degrees, we also have an important and exciting focus on work-based or alternative credentials. And interestingly, there hasn't been great data available on this historically. But it's back in the end of 2017 that I think it was the census gathered this data. for one of the first times where they found that among American adults, about 1 in 4 have some kind of non-degree credential. And here's how that breaks down. Again, it doesn't add up to 27% because you might have both a license and a certification, but it's 18% of American adults held a professional license, 6% had a certification, so that might be a PMI certification or supply chain or something in a healthcare field or finance, for example. And 8% had a post-secondary certificate, again, non-degree. So that would be a certificate, whether it's non-credit or for credit, from a University of Michigan or Stanford or University of Texas or somewhere else. So those are still relatively small numbers, but not insignificant when we think about the 20 million plus college students who are largely pursuing degree programs. The certificate portion is relatively speaking just a sliver of that. But a lot more professions and occupations are requiring or moving toward different forms of certification in the demonstration of competency. And in some cases, especially IT and other areas, these can be real alternatives to degrees. Now, we also have a new type of new categories, I should say, of alternative credentials emerging. And I like to think about this as a bit of a big bang. We're in the early stages of this universe. Do we have any physicists in the room or astrophysicists? I'm not one, so I'll probably get the analogy wrong, but you be careful when you're at the University of Michigan. Right? We have this expanding universe, and the sort of gravitational forces and the planets haven't settled. Right? We don't know what the winners and losers will be, or where the critical mass with employers and students and professionals will be around any one of these new constructs necessarily. But we're in that expansion phase where a lot is happening and a lot of new offerings are being launched and developed. So first, if we take the certificate category on the left, it's really interesting, and I'm fairly sure here at Michigan, across departments, colleges, and divisions, you probably have all sorts of forms of certificate that will all show up on a resume or be referred to in an interview or LinkedIn as simply a certificate, whether it was non-credit or for credit or assessed or not assessed or graduate level, or from a weekend program or from a MOOC or from a 8-week-long program. They're all in that certificate category. So for many years, employers have often been a little bit confused, and they know that they need to dig under the surface when someone cites a certificate as a credential. And a lot of the micro-credentialing and innovation that's happening, especially in online education from accredited private and public universities in the US, much of that is actually some sort of certificate offering. And it can be both transcripted and non-transcripted. So there's a lot of variety there. And that's both a challenge in the market, but also an opportunity because it's more or less a construct that people out there understand, employers, potential students, and so on. You also have digital badges, which in the early days seemed to be positioned as an alternative to degrees. I think it was a headline in the Chronicle that digital badges were poised to potentially overtake the college diploma. But what I have seen is much more of badging, if you think of it as an activity or as a process. It's being woven into degree programs. There's a lot of community colleges, Broward College in Florida, the University of, or sorry, not the University of, but rather the Colorado Community College System. They have woven digital badges into their offerings, and they have kind of stacked different badges up into certificates. At Northeastern, we have, and this is fairly rare, we've articulated IBM's badges in project management. We went in when we assessed them just like we would a course from another university, and how they were designed and what the curriculum was, et cetera. Those count for credit in some of our courses in our project management graduate degree program. So badging is being interwoven with degrees, and it's something that can be complementary. In addition to the fact that, yes, if you go to a conference and you participate in some continuing education and professional development, a digital badge may be awarded from that. Another major trend is companies like Cisco, Microsoft, Novell, and I already mentioned IBM. Rather than just awarding their traditional IT certificate, which is a piece of paper, it's now also in a digital badge form, and you can verify it, you can share it on social media, it can expire, and that sort of thing. So that's an interesting space on its own. And then, of course, we have proprietary micro-credentials, and if you look closely on the right, I've included the trademark symbol next to a few of these. The MicroMasters is a trademark of edX. You cannot offer a MicroMasters as an institution at this stage unless you are a participating edX partner. Similarly, the Nano degree is a product of Udacity, a tech startup out of Silicon Valley. There's another company that owns the term micro degree. And so these proprietary constructs are being developed and launched in the market. Some of them, as we'll talk about, have a lot of momentum, but a whole new category of credentials is emerging. And it will be very important to watch which of these have momentum, which of them are respected by employers, and which of them do students gravitate toward. And that's what we'll get at, I think, in the next slide here. But first, I just wanted to share a cartoon on all this that I graciously was able to borrow from Holly Zanville of the Lumina Foundation from one of her presentations. I think Lumina actually commissioned these cartoons. And this is a poker game. Who's holding the best hand? It's hard to tell. And you see, someone's holding 3 digital badges, another one has a degree, another a combination of a certificate and an industry certification. Until we have better data, until we have more standards, and so on, in certain situations, it's hard to tell what the best or the ideal credential is or where the ROI will be. So you need to be really thoughtful in that as we create policy and programs and so on. So employers, and the title of this talk, of course, is about employer demand and online credentials, and those will be major themes. Going back to our survey, as far as I know, no survey had been done on, well, what's hiring leaders' awareness of micro-credentials? Have they encountered these things? Are they more familiar with a micro degree versus a micro master's or something else? And we found it's about 15% of HR leaders have actually hired an individual that holds a micro credential. We'll unpack that a little bit in a moment, but the point is it's still early, right? There's not a lot of experience with any given micro credential, much less the whole category out there in the market. But over time, that will develop, as I'll speak to shortly, just as we've seen with online degrees. In the early days, employers didn't know, what was involved in an online degree from a university. Over time, many of them earned their own online degrees from institutions. They hired people or sent employees into online degree programs. And over 10, 20 years, a deeper understanding is developed, as is the case with any new product or new offering. And hopefully these are readable on this screen size. But this is a graphic showing, if we now break down across kind of a spectrum from I've never heard of this type of micro-credential, which is the dark blue, to I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it, a general awareness, the lighter blue. I've encountered this in screening and hiring candidates, which is the red, and then the more purplish red is that 15% on average that have hired someone who earned this. So maybe I'll walk over here for a moment. So what you can see, and I'd be careful about distinctions here due to sample size and whatnot, but verified certificates, right? Coursera, edX, they've been out in the market for the longest time with these certificate offerings. Things like the MicroMasters or the Nano degree, they're either smaller scale or newer. And what you find is that, yeah, half of employers have heard of these things, but it's really only around a third that have encountered a micro-credential to date in hiring and screening candidates. And you do get some distinctions between the varieties. And I think the market is settling around a few, insofar as edX and Coursera and a couple other firms are really the major players. But we do have some cases, like at Harvard Business School with their Credential of Readiness, what NYU has done with their diploma, and some other cases where institutions are developing and launching their own credential construct. But a big theme we'll come back around to often is that a lot of the innovation and a lot of the demand appears to very much be around traditional credentials, traditional credential constructs, but new ways to earn them, whether it's through competency-based education, online learning, or MOOCs, or things that just involve more transparency, digital badging on top of a degree, let's say. And as we think about this credentialing landscape, one way to view it in terms of the momentum flows and the trends and where all this converges is in terms of, along the y-axis, the credential length and depth. So doctoral degrees are very much sort of by and for and of the academy for the most part. Bachelor's degrees, right, those typically take around 4 years. Not always, of course. But when you move out to associate degrees and applied associate degrees in community colleges, certainly master's degrees, where actually the majority of master's enrollment in the US for many years now is in professional programs. It's not research-based masters. You're getting more market-oriented, which is the x-axis. The orientation toward the academy versus the market and the skills needs and the demands of employers, which when you go all the way out on that spectrum is where these non-institutional offerings live. We've long had professional certifications and those kinds of offerings offered by associations, IT firms, financial companies, and so on. And where these two overlap is this zone of growing convergence, where higher ed, represented in blue, and these are roughly relative to the market size, if you will, in terms of the number of students enrolled, is unbundling very often, trying to get more market aligned in many cases, focusing more on employability, and making credentials or breaking out credentials that are shorter, smaller, and more focused, more targeted. That kind of brings us in that direction. Then on the other side, the non-institutional providers in many cases, and I didn't include boot camps in here because they don't really award a credential, but a major trend is boot camp firms doing intensive coding programs, partnering with a university so that that experience stacks into a university credential, if we were to add them into the graphic. These certification providers and then the MOOC firms who are non-institutional entities, originally what you might have been getting was a Udacity or a Coursera credential, not a credential from the institution itself. They're moving in that direction. They're trying to add imprimatur and currency to their offering by partnering with traditional colleges and universities. So that's one way to look at some of these trends and themes. So if we talk about online degrees and online credentials, and this is basically a timeline here. It's conceptual, but this has steadily evolved over time. And there haven't been a ton of academic studies or projects or national surveys on this over the years, but it's something that I've tracked and been involved with the whole way. I would note that very often if you look at older research and even current research, it really depends, of course, on how you frame the question. People would ask about, well, what do you think, hiring leader or CEO, about an online university? And an online university would connote the University of Phoenix or just a non-traditional provider, especially back in the day. And there have really been very few purely online universities that have had regional accreditation. And that world has now, of course, evolved into what we'll be talking about here, which is some of the most prestigious and large-scale and most esteemed institutions in the world offering online degrees. But in any event, back in 2005, I think this was an academic paper, a question was posed about a hypothetical candidate. Would you prefer the one with the online degree or the traditional degree? Of course, 98% said the traditional degree, but that's one 2005 data point. The Society for Human Resource Management, the main association or one of the principal groups of HR leaders in the country that looks at best practices and trends and so on. 2010, they found that hiring leaders, 34% viewed online degrees favorably. So it's just a third. Bit of a stigma attached to online degrees back then. A study in 2013, you'll see this is a tiny bit of an outlier, and this is all relative and notional, right? It's not to be super scientific about it. It was getting closer to about half would hire a candidate with an online degree. They'd be open to it in 2013. At Northeastern, we did a national survey of hiring leaders in 2013. We found 40% felt that an online degree was similar in quality to a traditional degree, and then a year later, it had risen to 48%. Similar finding with CBE programs in 2015, and then a survey in 2017, 57%. And getting to the punchline here, in a recent survey, we found this has now risen, depending on how you ask it, to about 61%. So a majority of hiring leaders, for the first time, now believe that an online credential, and that's purposefully inclusive of non-degree credentials, something that was earned online, is generally equal in quality to a traditional credential. Now, as encouraging as that is, and that progression that happens over time because it's a cultural thing, it's still 39% that believe that, maybe it's not quite as good. And that varies, of course, by industry and for different reasons. But I think it's important foundational information in terms of the growing acceptance of online degrees and credentials among employers. And here's how that breaks down in terms of late 2018. It's the 55%, and there's actually plus 6% who believe that credentials earned online are generally higher quality than those completed in person. And we could make a case for that in terms of thoughtfulness of design and ability to track outcomes and so on for certain programs at certain times. But it's encouraging that employers are more accepting of online study today. Now, if we move beyond employers for a bit and think about institutions and general market trends, one data set I find interesting, and this is actual kind of bars here. You see this long tail where you have, I think it's 1,000, 1,500 plus accredited colleges and universities in the US are offering online degrees, but the 100 largest have half of the market. They have a 47% market share. So half of the market is just the top 100, and the bars on the left would be Grand Canyon University and Southern New Hampshire University and the University of Phoenix and so on. And an important point is that's actually up from 3 years prior. It was 42%. So the large are getting larger. Those that have online resources, infrastructure, brands, they're spending, and on average, they're sort of winning in the market and taking more share versus if you're out here, maybe there's a small school elsewhere in Michigan or a religious college somewhere in Pennsylvania. 10 years ago, they could have said, well, you know what, we're going to bring our MBA online and we're going to build a more regional market or a national market from that program. Today, they'd be competing with 1,000 other programs, and it's not quite as easy because there's more choice and there's more options. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. And if we look historically, this text is not meant to be read. It's just conceptual because it's actually the top 100 in the US News rankings in 2010. If you look back in 2010, and I had done this coding because I was curious and trying to track brand and prestige and who was active in online and who wasn't at that time, what you see signified in red is institutions that really didn't have much of an online presence, right? So the whole top third and top half of the US News and World Report, not many of them were active in online education, certainly not the Ivy League schools and so on. But it's when you move down to the Penn States with the World Campus, Drexel University, the University of Florida, and so on, that you saw much more active online players. But the prestigious schools were not particularly focused online. That, in just the last 3 years, certainly in the last 5 years, has changed dramatically, where you now have online degrees and offerings from Harvard, Yale, Michigan, Penn, Northwestern, name a school, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in this next slide as well. Independent of mode, independent of whether it's online or traditional face-to-face, it's been interesting to me that the largest awarders in terms of scale of master's degrees in the United States, you see some usual suspects because these are scale institutions. The Chronicle of Higher Ed has kind of coined this term lately, mega universities. They're going for scale and online presence. Walden and Grand Canyon for-profit, and then Liberty and Western Governors are now two of the largest private universities in the country. They have tens, hundreds of thousands, or over 100,000 online students in some cases. So you'd expect to find them when you say, well, who awards the most master's degrees? Keeping in mind that, especially at an institution like this, but at many institutions, when you have prestige and high admission standards for your undergraduate class, one might assume that you don't do graduate education on a large scale. And we are in a market where, I began earlier, where graduate education is increasingly in demand. Well, what you find is that toward the very top 15, top 10 awarders of master's degrees by volume in the US, many years running, include some of the most prestigious and generally seen as selective universities. Harvard, Columbia, Penn would be in there as well. Johns Hopkins, USC, University of Washington. University of Michigan, I think, is 16th with about 4,200 master's degree graduates a year, which is, I'm trying to remember who that's alongside. It might be University of Maryland, College Park, maybe right around Johns Hopkins. So that's a pretty significant scale. And I would argue that offering graduate education does not necessarily hurt an institution's brand. And that's long been the case in terms of how some institutions have thought about their online presence, especially in terms of offering online graduate degrees. So that's a bit of food for thought. And then as we think about how MOOCs are changing things, which is another theme here, we're only at the start of this era, where MOOCs are changing how online degrees have been offered traditionally. They're creating new options. So some really big numbers here in terms of a pipeline. I've just updated these. There's more than 100 million registered massively open online course learners worldwide. And that number's been slowing down a little bit, but still growing pretty dramatically. There's 630 different MOOC-based credential programs. That doesn't mean 630 different types of credential, but 630 different offerings from various institutions. And there are now 45, this number was 15 a year ago, 45 MOOC-based degree programs that have now enrolled 10,000 plus students. So the IMBA at the University of Illinois, the CS program at Georgia Tech, and a handful of other examples, they've been very successful in terms of student success and also certainly the financial metrics and the enrollment. Digital badges, more than 8 million of them have been issued. So this is all kind of creating a pipeline where some of these things can stack into an online degree program, but they haven't necessarily been competitors to an online or a face-to-face degree program. And it's characterized some of the dialogues I've participated in so far in my brief visit. But I find this very important in that we now have new stations emerging, and we're starting to substitute out the different services and expectations that are associated with what a degree is or what a credential from a university is. So you have your traditional degree all the way on the left side of the spectrum. That's sort of the Lexus version, if you will, right? That's the higher priced, all the classic high touch faculty interaction. And then over all the way at the other end, we have these low cost and sometimes free micro-credentials. But now in the middle, there's this new thing. I need to come up with a better term other than hybrid offering, where there's elements of MOOCs and sort of taking out some of the service and taking out some of the cost in the credential that emerges as kind of an interim station, a $20,000 degree for the mass market versus the thing that you can get online for free. And as more of these programs launch in various verticals, whether it's public health or computer science or somewhere else, so far, the ones that are doing the 1/3 of the total cost offering on a MOOC platform, they've been outpacing all of their competitors in terms of the enrollment growth and the market share that they're taking, if of course that's the goal, much less impact and other things we could look at. So I find this spectrum that's emerging where maybe the admission standards are different from this program, but you don't get as much access to your peers or other benefits, becomes very interesting because it does mean that we think about costs and ROI and value differently. And also, of course, there's maybe the potential for some confusion out there when you have different versions of the same degree program. Another dynamic here is we can think about the higher ed value chain classically. And I'm realizing I'm in Michigan, sometimes I use the automotive example. Not an automotive expert either. But classically, the auto manufacturers, I think, were vertically integrated, right? They built the wheels and the chassis and the engine, and over time that became a more horizontal global supply chain. We've had that same scenario for a long time with higher ed, where the university and the professor is the knowledge creator. They disseminate the knowledge, they do the teaching. The university is in charge of the assessment, and the university owns and awards the credential. It's very early, but now for the first time, certainly we all know you can get and access knowledge in ways that we couldn't 15 years ago through YouTube and through MOOCs and other forms with cloud computing and with the internet. But we also have groups that are emerging as the assessors or just as the credentialers. So an institution or an entity that might be a credentialer of knowledge that came from somewhere else or from an educational program through competency-based education or through prior learning assessment. So this value chain in terms of some real private providers and experiments that institutions are doing and venture capital that's backing entities in any one of these domains, it's leading to sort of a new value chain for post-secondary education that will be very very interesting and important to watch. And as our last thematic area here, I want to circle back around to employers and dig more into the employer hiring process and some of the trends and new developments that are emerging with them. One key thing is talent or people analytics. So in all this conversation about what credentials are employers seeking, I think we often assume that employers have very rigorous processes driven by the competitive market, supported by technology and years of practice, where they are rigorous and consistent and world-class in how they set job qualifications, design jobs, and assign educational credentials to a job posting. Of course, that's not typically the reality. And they are starting to get more savvy about it. And as you have new HR technology systems that emerge, as you have the pressures of, at least right now, knock on wood, sort of a full employment job market and a long run of success in terms of job creation, it's very tight. And so employers have to think beyond degrees, and they have to get more rigorous about the educational and the experience qualifications that they're seeking. So more employers are investing in talent and people analytics. It's a big trend in HR. And this question from our survey really illustrates that it's less than 20% who say that they as an employer have a rigorous and data-driven process. But you see the next category, 41%, are beginning to leverage more data and analysis to shape these kinds of decisions. And that, of course, is how analytics and data science have started to impact all fields and functions. The other related thing is this skills-based hiring movement, or competency-based hiring. Due to both the tight job market, or actually also technology and some of the tools and assessments that are available, but also for equity reasons and diversity and inclusion, many employers have recognized, you know what, we need to stop just requiring a degree when it might not be needed and make some intentional effort to look beyond degrees and to do some more direct assessment and employ some new practices. This was actually an area of our employer survey that surprised me in terms of how high the percentages were. So we found that a quarter of employers have a formal effort underway. And the signature one, it's a bit of an outlier, it's been very successful for them, is IBM's New Collar Jobs initiative. They tried to brand that term if you're familiar with it. But a quarter have a formal effort underway to move in this direction, and another 40% are exploring or considering it. That is potentially very disruptive and meaningful. This will take time to develop, but if more employers harness data and look to alternative assessments and other means rather than degrees, that will very much potentially challenge what is the value of a degree and when do they look for it. But it's something that's still very early and emerging. Now, if you put that alongside some other things that are talked about as potentially disrupting the degree in hiring, and even though there's a lot of data points in this graphic, I'd really simplify it. We asked employers toward the end of the survey, between online micro-credentials, digital badges, simulation-based hiring, e-portfolios, or pre-hire assessment, all innovations or products or practices that could disrupt the degree and its role in hiring, employers' reliance on degrees, which do you think will have the nearest term impact to challenge that role of the degree? And you can see very clearly it's pre-hire assessment. There's an excellent report produced last year by Ithaca S&R with funding from Strada Education Network on pre-hire assessment and how more employers are experimenting with direct testing, which of course you run into equal opportunity issues. You have the challenge of designing a solid assessment. Often they need to be custom, but that is an area of growing focus and growing investment. And you can see a pretty large share of employers thought that that is the thing to watch in this space over the next few years. One other thing that's happening with certain employers is they are emerging as recognized credential issuers on their own. So you have, although it's somewhat unique, IBM's digital badging initiative. They have designed the courses, they run the courses and the programs, they issue the badges. They're an educational entity, much like Microsoft and Cisco and others have always been. Google, because they wanted to train more IT support people, developed their own IT certificate on Coursera, and they've also gone out and partnered with community colleges to integrate this online certificate into community college curriculum and that kind of thing. They are a credentialer, as are many other companies via Coursera or their own offerings. And that too is something important for universities and colleges to watch, is this competition with employers themselves and with for-profit entities. But at the same time, in most cases, there's opportunities for partnership in these kinds of things, as we've actually done at Northeastern with these two firms in particular, where these industry-based credentials are increasingly being articulated into master's programs, bachelor's programs, associate degree programs. And one thing I'll close on, also from our survey, was after this sort of battery of questions about your opinions on online credentials and where you think hiring is headed and so on, we asked directly, and we did it as a forced ranking question where they could choose their top three. What would your recommendations be to colleges and universities? Where should they focus? Because in my world, doing this sort of research, there's a lot of discussion, for example, about digitizing credentials or integrating the data that comes out of universities with an applicant tracking system, the kinds of things you see toward the bottom of the chart. Toward the top of the chart, there's a very clear theme, and it's an area that I'm involved with myself quite a bit at Northeastern. But the top one is include real-world projects and engagements with employers in the world of work, experiential learning, capstones, projects, cooperative education, apprenticeships that might be tied to a credential program. Provide academic credit for experience in on-the-job learning. So breaking beyond that traditional barrier between learning that happens in the world of work and learning that happens in an academic setting. And then including more industry and employer validation of the curriculum. So Many programs, of course, might have an advisory board of employers who occasionally provide input on a curriculum, but it tends to be very rare that you have active employer engagement outside of some new models or a particularly deep engineering program or that kind of thing. So the work-based learning theme and the blurring the boundaries, breaking down the barrier between academic learning and on-the-job learning come out as the top recommended priorities there. So with that, we will end the presentation portion, and excited to have a discussion, a Q&A, shared examples on what you're thinking about here and what your reflections might be, or just questions that you have. Thanks. Yes?
Thinking back to an earlier slide that was showing kind of the employer knowledge of the different micro-credentials, I found very curious the positioning of the Master Track certificate as the third most recognized, or in that generally, because it had about a year and a half, I think, deficit in terms of the announcement from the MicroMasters. And so MicroMasters had more time for maturity, so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts as to why that might be.
Yeah, it's a great question and keen observation. I had the same question when the survey data came back. On one hand, I think, that kind of chart, when you break it down 7 ways, and the fact that most employers, if you think mainly of the one, have I hired someone, right? It's only 15% of them. I'd be careful about too many comparisons, but I think part of it is that it's been, I believe, larger scale than edX in terms of the number of enrollees. And also a few people told me that they thought Coursera had done a particularly good job of marketing that program. So while it's very new, it was much more out there, and it had achieved more enrollment, and as a result, it has a little bit more awareness. But that surprised me as well when the data came back. Yeah, the other thing that's clear though too is micro degree, for example, which I think is also in that chart. We had qualitative questions in there too. I love to do some selective open-ended questions and mine the text and really read what employers' rationale or observations are for certain things. And one thing that became clear, and this also sits alongside interview-based research, ethnography, visiting employers, it's not like it's in a vacuum, is that micro degree is sort of a catch-all term for micro-credential when employers think of this category of things if they're even familiar with them. So while it is a branded term that's out there a little bit, all of these things are micro degrees, and so do you really know the micro masters versus the master track versus the micro degree? I think there's probably some confusion or lack of awareness there as well because of the similarity and because of the newness of it all. But indeed, over time, as a couple of years go by, or if you had to make a decision about which construct, which platform, what does one mean or another, we're going to want some better data from employers and others on what are these things associated with. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, so, sorry. A lot of the data is about from the employer side, but I'm wondering if anybody has looked at those individuals who have attained micromasters or micro degrees and surveyed them to figure out where they are, what they're doing, how that's worked, how it's applied.
Yep, great question. Yeah, so the framing for this discussion was more around employers, but there's surprisingly relatively little research. I think some is being done here, but some researchers at Columbia University, I think in Teachers College.
We're actually working.
Yep, or you're working with them, yep. They're doing, is it like in 3 stages of surveys, and the first one was on motivations, and then more tracking students over time. So there hasn't been a lot that's been published on that topic, but a really important area of research.
They're still acquiring a fair amount of trying to get a number of responses back in post-survey data to really find out more about the results for people in the career fields.
Yeah. Yep, and getting the data from the providers and or like direct access to the students. Whereas if we wanted to do a survey on people who hold a master's degree, we could go out, we know that 1 in every 10 people, we'd have a large enough sample. The number of people that hold some sort of micro-credential that we'd be interested in is so small that it's hard to just go out publicly and find those folks necessarily, versus working through edX and their data, or with a university such as this and a cohort of their students. So it'll be interesting to watch. I think was there one over here? No? But yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Right, this way.
I mentioned to you that I was part of a
workshop a month or so ago, and we had a few people at the workshop who were using analytics to, as a service to match employers and employees. And one of the things that they repeatedly said, and other people who were there said as well, is that employers don't really know what they want employees to be able to do. So around these concepts of 21st century skills and non-cognitive skills and all that, there isn't really a clear articulation by employers about what they want these employees to be able to do. In the case of these alternative credentials as a whole, are they just sort of trusting that they are developing the kind of skills that employers think they want, or without having to articulate them, or how is that matching process working if more and more employers are starting to see these credentials as validation that this potential employee can do what they need them to do?
Yeah, I think it certainly varies quite a bit by occupation, industry, even sometimes region, right? If you're in Silicon Valley versus Charlotte, North Carolina, or something like that. But most of the market is these highly specialized, very targeted offerings that tend to be about technology skills or specialized skills, right? Versus even when they're not universally used or understood, there are some frameworks out there for degrees, right? And as it is, right? What does a bachelor's mean across your colleges and schools within this institution, much less elsewhere in the state, much less a private school in Kentucky or somewhere else? And there's such variation as it stands, but there is the various kind of credential frameworks that are useful. The examples that kind of my mind gravitates toward are when certain industries, because they have a particular talent gap or need, right? When the nursing profession comes together, or there's a need to set a standard in clean energy or autonomous vehicles or something else, they come together and you get sort of a high representation of the specific needs in that zone, and then programs and institutions can go out and design to that, versus the much more universal question of, well, what level or type or how do we demonstrate a critical thinking skill at this level of education or in this discipline versus that. So it's complicated, and certainly job market information systems, labor market analytics can be helpful in pointing us in the right direction. Meeting with employers can be useful, but at its most aligned, it's this cognitive task analysis where you go in and you study what makes a good doctor or mechanical engineer, and you reverse engineer what they know and how they learned it, and then you build it into a program.
So that, if I'm understanding what you're saying then, that has greater implication for jobs where you can fairly clearly define what the skill set is versus this kind of notion of general liberal arts education at the undergraduate level.
Right. Yeah, most of the enrollment and other examples I could have brought in, it's around technical sorts of areas and specialized things versus the broad-based and clearly valued general education that comes with or should come with most degrees and most levels of degree.
So then what would the trade-off be then if employers want more of this real-world experience on the job included in the sort of regular traditional courses? What's the, how are you going to make that balance, or what's the trade-off then?
Yeah, well, you'd have to make a trade-off, or you could do both. It could be a both and. You could have an experiential opportunity and just accelerate other parts of the education. Or one thing, and I'm not involved enough in terms of where the balance of my work and research focuses in traditional undergraduate programs, which is much of the work of a university. I'm more in the professional and online and graduate zone. But in all this, one of the biggest opportunities I feel and see is to evolve the credentials that we have, to evolve the bachelor's degree,
Sure.
right? 120 credits, how does it link to other things? Could you unpack it and re-envision it? That's just a giant opportunity where we've built things around this construct that's 100 years old.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, just to build on that, right now there's a conversation going on at NACE, which is the National Association of Colleges and Employers, so about digital badging and what employers want out of it and so forth. And they've actually started a Slack group, so if you're interested in hearing more about what's going on with that, check in with me and I can show you how to help you with that. But that idea too is everyone who started answering was all on the academic side. And so engaging the employers who are part of this group into what they're after and how they want to engage with this idea is a little different.
Excellent. Yes.
In the example you showed about digital badging, you mentioned about Northeastern having adopted the IBM project management track and giving formal recognition of that. Do you know, I'm kind of wondering, I'm curious as to how that was accepted and whether did that supplement existing offerings in that area? Did that supplant anything that was being offered? And just in general, how did that, the adoption of that?
Yeah, so by design, and I think it's 3 particular courses that lined up with courses that we already offered. So we have had a PMI accredited Masters in Project Management, which because of that construct, and maybe even if you didn't have that accreditation, it's built around an industry standard. So then when IBM has their offering in terms of, well, what are the important principles of project management and all of that, you know, it's very much aligned. There's a lot of overlap there. And so the faculty went in and identified, you know, where do these badges, because the given series of IBM badges, in many cases, it's a series and it's levels of proficiency. So it's sort of like you're a novice project manager all the way up to like a real expert. And so over the course of that, there's enough offerings that they sort of line up with aspects of the courses we were offering. And this is the issue a lot with articulation in higher education many times is, you know, you're going to lose the revenue from that course, or you're going to feel, well, maybe that course isn't as good a quality as the course we offer. But we were purposefully wanting to do this as a pipeline, where if you have thousands of IBM digital badge holders, and based on the philosophy, why do you need to repeat that content? Let's experiment with, and it's still early. We will give you credit for this. You don't have to repeat it. You have demonstrated by earning that badge that you have the competency and the capability and the knowledge that you would get otherwise through our course. And we did something similar with Google, where we have a bachelor's degree completion program for adults in IT, and some of those basic principles are covered in its IT certificate program. So I see more of that happening in the future, and if it's not institutions doing it in their own interest, it does look like various states, private foundations, and other groups will incentivize and create some experiments to kind of encourage that sort of work to happen. Yeah. Yes?
As more alternative credentials enter the space, what are your thoughts on the challenges of potential sort of fraudulent credentials? And do employers have the tools necessary to validate the authenticity of these various credentials?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I had a little bit of a journey with it when I was writing my book going back a couple years, where in my initial vision of it, in terms of the interview questions I had for employers, I figured that there was this whole credential verification, because especially around badges, this is mentioned, or in ed tech, if your frame is educational technology and what's the potential of these technologies, what problems could it solve, you know, where might it be a good place to start a company, you hear a lot about the infrastructure and the credential verification. So I set out, among other questions, to ask employers, well, you know, tell me about the problems you're having around educational verification. And it wasn't a major issue. They said, for the most part, and this wasn't a scientific survey, but in this sort of learning process, they said, yeah, there's 3 or 4 major vendors in the HR market. For the most part, people don't claim credentials that they don't have because they know that there's different risks and policies associated with that. So it obviously varies by employer and state and situation, but you know, many online applications for jobs, when you click submit, you know, there's a tiny disclaimer that says, hey, I can be fired later if I've misrepresented anything in here, that kind of thing. And it just didn't come up as a major problem. That said, you know, with badging or with just electronic and digital credentials, so we can have a digital version of a degree, let's say, I think it's streamlined, and of course also there's a lot of talk, you know, I'm intrigued and I think it'll be useful, but blockchain, for example. Oh, how does blockchain apply to credentialing? I don't know that it's necessarily needed or, you know, going to be this sort of magical solution because it's not a problem I'm hearing a whole lot. It will be important. So in LinkedIn, for example, they may have changed this, but I don't think they have. You could go in your LinkedIn profile right now and claim a credential, a University of Michigan Coursera certificate or a Harvard degree that you do not own. And LinkedIn's general philosophy is it's social validation, right? You're getting endorsed by colleagues that you've worked with in the past and so on. They haven't made it sort of verifiable. But you could envision a system where you cannot claim a credential unless it's verified. Or, as I believe you can do today, when you put that IBM digital badge in your LinkedIn profile, or if Michigan had worked with a company to digitize the certificate or master's that it offered, you can click through and there is actual direct verification. Are you the holder of that? You know, what's your name? And even what was some of the evidence attached to earning that credential. So it's an important area, but it's one that's still sort of evolving. Yeah, yes?
Getting to the skill development workforce issue, have you seen employers starting to basically outsource learning within their organizations, meaning, you know, so taking this chief learning officer notion, which is that you need people to be retrained on equipment or specific tasks. Are people using edX or other, you know, badging to just offload that cost?
Yes, yeah, and a very relevant question. So in this tight labor market, and in general with the arguable, you know, demand and need for lifelong learning worldwide, if you look at things like the PwC Global CEO Survey, or many other surveys that are global, large-scale, representative, going to the C-suite or the board, what you will see is that talent and human capital has risen to the top of the agenda, the company-wide agenda, not just, you know, some units area of priority over the last few years. Yet, there's, by certain measures, a disinvestment in a changing market and economics around training and learning development. That's a bit of a paradox in terms of a disconnect with the priority and what CEOs say versus where they're actually investing. So on the traditional tuition assistance side, which has partly fueled, let's say, the online degree market, or traditionally the executive MBA, Ford or Kaiser Healthcare or some other employer would tap a cohort of leaders, potential leaders on the shoulder and say, we're going to pay for your MBA. You go out, you get it, you come back, and you have that traditional kind of tuition assistance program. Or you can complete your bachelor's at night and we'll give you $5,250. That percentage of employers that offers tuition assistance and the amounts that they invest in tuition assistance has actually declined over the last 5 to 10 years. Pretty steadily too, versus like ups and downs. And that is in contrast to the headlines, another important trend, but for different motivations, where you see Starbucks in Arizona State, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Walmart. They're investing in education as a retention tool for frontline service employees who generally have low wages as an added benefit to keep them in fields where you have high turnover. So that isn't as much about developing, for the most part, that isn't as much about when you see that trend and you read it in the New York Times on the front pages, and those are useful programs for people and useful for society. That does not mean that companies in the whole are investing in their workforce. The other thing, and more to your question, I'm establishing the context here, when you look at actual training and investment in people and learning and development internally, on an inflation-adjusted basis, and there's not the best data on it, but surveys that SHRM and other groups do, Training Magazine, ATD, the Association for Training and Development, that is basically flat. And what is happening increasingly is what is called microlearning, and sort of on-demand, go into a portal, go into a subscription that we have purchased. So Coursera for Business, or what edX is doing, but I don't think they're quite as far along. Degreed is an interesting company. There's a market of platforms in the HR space that Josh Burson has called learning experience platforms, LXPs. So instead of having an LMS and your own internal proprietary corporate training, it's more of a portal that will connect you to YouTube resources, MOOCs, or subscriptions that you have. And the other part of that is that I think when you look at it from sort of a more of, I guess, a sociological perspective, there's a shifting employer-employee compact in this age of greater mobility and less sort of dedication. The word's escaping me, but the idea of loyalty, employer loyalty and employee loyalty, that I think is much like the shift from pensions to 401ks and defined benefit plans. In the past, the company created your pension and you were taken care of and you stayed with that employer. Now I think a little bit of the same thing is happening with learning, where you're going to be more mobile as an employee, but the employer is less inclined to invest in a degree. Instead, and this is where micro-credentials come back in, they'll invest in the micro-credential, which is more targeted and job relevant. If at any point you survey employers and you ask, well, which would you prefer? Would you prefer for your employee, as a result of this training experience, to get a degree, a certificate? What they want is the cheapest and shortest term and most directly aligned with their needs when they're the buyer of it type of offering. Micro-credentials actually kind of bridge this between the the employee, the individual, is always going to want the portable credential. It becomes part of your identity. We still tend to only earn a handful of credentials, right? I have a degree from wherever, I am an alum. That stays with you over the course of your career. And you could get a micro-credential that maybe your employer paid for, and then maybe you have the option to stack that into a degree versus completing a really good leadership development program or training experience that is every bit the equivalent of a university certificate or maybe a university degree, but if it doesn't have a name and accreditation and et cetera behind it, it doesn't have the same portability and job market value. So that's a long answer, but an important set of trends. Yeah.